everyone, welcome to another episode of Gripe, the show for short, sweet reviews of new release movies, plus the one thing that annoyed me the most. Today, I'm going to be talking about Star Trek Beyond, the third installment of the J.J. Abrams directed/produced series of Star Trek movies, the rebooted Star Trek universe, as it were. The entire cast from the original two movies is back, of course. Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, Carl Urban, Zoe Saldana, Simon Pegg, John Cho, Anton Yelchin, they're all back. So it's basically the same crew, the same core crew that we had in the original two movies. Obviously, they added some new characters for both good and bad. Idris Elba plays the villain in this movie. Sofia Boutella, who cut her teeth and literally cut people in half in Kingsman, is back here as Jayla, a stranded alien on this planet. And the film is directed by Justin Lin, so J.J. Abrams, since he went off and did that whole Star Wars thing, decided to hand it off to somebody else. And in this case, he went with four-time Fast and Furious director Justin Lin. So, before I get into what this movie was, I'm going to just kind of explain the plot a little bit. The movie basically takes place in, during the Enterprise's mission out into space. The Enterprise's goal is basically to spend 5 years in space, exploring, keeping peace in the galaxy, just kind of like being, it is the exploration aspect of Star Trek. That is kind of the fundamental aspect of it. And as they're out there, and they've been out there for 3 years, and they're starting to kind of like it's starting to stagnate. Things just seem like people are, falling into bad habits. It's like they keep running into bad situations. Like the whole movie starts with Kirk trying to negotiate a truce between these two alien races, and it doesn't necessarily go well. But it's just kind of that's what they're doing right now, and he's kind of losing his interest, his enthusiasm for this job. So when they go and resupply and all that, there's a distress basically that comes through. A alien woman is basically running for her life and says that she was able to escape when her ship got taken down on this planet. So the Federation, of course, sends the Enterprise and their crew out into this nebula to this planet to try and save this alien's ship and try to get them back. But when they do, they're attacked by a vicious alien who has almost like a hive, as Jayla calls them, bees, who attack the Enterprise, and they're specifically looking for one thing on the Enterprise, and that is what, incidentally, Kirk was trying to offer the aliens originally in this peace negotiation. And so the Enterprise is destroyed, and the crew is stranded on this planet. Some of them are able to move around freely, but the other ones are captured by Krall. And so while the ones who are captured by Krall are trying to find a way to escape, everybody else is trying to find a way to, save the rest of the crew and also get off the planet because they don't have a ship. And when they're there, they find Scotty, Simon Pegg's character, runs into Jayla, and basically she takes him back to her home, which happens to be an old Federation ship that had crash-landed on that planet hundreds of years, 100 years ago, basically. So it's been there for a long time. It's like an ancient relic, basically, of on this planet. And so while they try to get this ship, they're also trying to save their crew, and Krall there's a lot of mystery around who Krall is. He seems to have this real hell-bent anger toward the Federation. You're not exactly sure why. He also has this ability to essentially take people's life. He can take people's life force to give himself life, so he can essentially live forever. As long as he has people who he can steal their energy, he can essentially live forever. And then, of course, there's the rescue operation, there's getting the ship off, all while Krall, once he has the pieces of the puzzle to his super weapon that he wants to use, he wants to use this super weapon that he has against the Federation space station, which is essentially a giant city in space. It's not just like a small space station. It's like an actual city with buildings and everything. It's huge, which they call Yorktown. which I guess is a reference to Yorktown from the series. But anyhow, so obviously Crawl, gets his weapon, goes after Yorktown. The Federation, the Enterprise crew, they get the ship up and running and start chasing after him, and that's where they reveal who Crawl really is. But of course they stop him, and it becomes this okay, it kind of gives them that desire to go back out and explore again, especially with a new Enterprise that they're building at the end of the movie. And that's how the movie ends, is basically them, getting ready to go back out on the newly built Enterprise. So, I should have given a spoiler warning, but I will now. So, if you don't want to hear spoilers, you're going to have to turn back now, because there are going to be some spoilers here, particularly when it comes to my key gripe. So one of the things that sets this movie apart from the other two, aside from both the humor and the story itself, is that this one really does feel more like an episode of Star Trek. It actually has some of that cheesy type of, if you watch the original series, or you watch Next Generation, any of the television series, it has that just kind of, plot. It's like they're out there, they're doing something, there's a distress call, and then they end up on this mysterious planet with somebody with a mysterious agenda. They have to, fight them, and then at the end of the story, they're able to either defeat the enemy or come to some sort of understanding. And there are even parts in this movie where I'm looking at Crawl going, is this Q? Is this is he gonna just turn into Q here? Because I almost felt like he was testing them at times. But that, in a sense, is both a good thing for the movie, because it does set it apart from, Into Darkness and the original Star Trek reboot. But it's also kind of a bad thing, and I'm actually going to get into my key gripe right now, because this is one of the things that was bugging me throughout the entire movie. So, the movie itself, follows, the Enterprise and Crawl, and when they encounter Crawl, he it's immediately violence. It's immediately kill everybody, destroy the Enterprise, find what they need, and take it. That's their mission. For basically the rest of the movie, Crawl is talking specifically to Uhura about the difference between strength in taking things, or strength in unity, or strength in being an individual, or strength being unified. It's kind of their he obviously has this beef with the Federation, and you're not sure why until the very end when they reveal who Crawl really is. And my key gripe there is the fact that this movie is similar to a Star Trek episode, just extended an extra hour, actually really hurts it in that regard when you are trying to do the villain reveal of who they are too late in the story. I feel like for the first half of the movie, I didn't care about Crawl at all. There was nothing about him that was unique or intriguing. He was just a, monster villain who was hell-bent on destroying the Federation for some unknown reason. You figure it was they might have destroyed his, they might have killed his family, or they might have, destroyed his planet, similar to, what happened with, the Romulans in the first Star Trek movie. You figured it would be something like that, and ultimately it's not. And the ultimate reason has some intrigue to it, but it takes way too long to get there, to the point where you're just this is so standard, this is so uninteresting, that by the time they reveal who Crawl really is, it's oh, that's kind of cool. But the problem is you've already forgotten so much about the stuff that he said, because it's just so generic and so basic. They basically took a 1 hour Star Trek episode and stretched it into 2 hours. If this were a 1 hour episode, this formula works, because you're not wasting so much time with the build-up, with the exposition. You're getting little bits and pieces here, and then they do the reveal within the span of an hour. Whereas with 2 hours, you got to fill in more of that intrigue, because they don't want to reveal the big, the reason or the big twist until the very end. And unlike movies that have a surprising twist, like the Old Boys of the world, it really, there's nothing that really stands out as to what the twist is going to be. I mean, there's little bits and pieces here and there, but when it does happen, it's like, oh, okay. I mean, you kind of get it, you understand it, but it just seems like there's not a whole lot of build up to it because the movie is so distracted by other things, namely like Jayla's character, sort of her, what's interesting about her character, and trying to figure out this device, which in itself is almost a MacGuffin in the movie, and the story is just so distracted throughout the entire middle of the plot that you just lose interest in who Crawl is. And then when they reveal who Crawl is, it's like, oh, okay, so there actually was a twist to this movie. I guess what I'm saying is that the way the story is written, there's no build-up to that twist. It just they throw the twist in there because it's like, okay, now wait, we actually had a twist here. There was nothing that really built up to it. Everything about it was just so standard and basic. The villain was vanilla in a lot of ways because there wasn't anything intriguing about him until you find out who he is. It's interesting now to go back. You could go back and watch it with that in mind, knowing who the villain is, and you're going to get the movie is going to watch differently. But it's one of those where you lose interest too much in the middle of the movie to be totally blown away by the ending. If anything, the ending just kind of like gives you a little bit of a confirmation that some of your suspicions might have been true, but it doesn't blow you away. And I think that's a failure on the screen, the story to flesh out a character, to make that character intriguing throughout the story without just waiting until the very end to make that character interesting. So that is my big key gripe with this movie, is they really did not flesh out Crawl's character enough throughout the movie to make him interesting until the very end. And that just, it made that movie a little bit hard to watch because it's like, okay, this is so standard, this is so cliche, it's just like watching any other episode of Star Trek, and you kind of just, you lose interest in the story. You're just more interested in like, okay, get to some action now, or get to some fun, which obviously this movie has a ton of. It's very much in the same vein of, in that J.J. Abrams universe that we've, already seen 2 movies for. Now, it's obvious, let me kind of go into this now. It's obvious that they wanted to distance themselves from Into Darkness. Now, I didn't hate Into Darkness. I actually really enjoyed Into Darkness. I actually enjoyed it when I first saw it a little bit more than the original. On a few repeat viewings, I saw a lot of the flaws that everyone else kind of points out, but it's still an entertaining movie, and it's intriguing in a lot of ways because they, in contrast to Crawl, they do make Khan or John Harrison that character interesting. They give you a lot of things about him that make you want to know more, whereas with Crawl, they only give you stuff to make him seem, it's just like he's just a generic villain. It's just like, here's a weird looking villain, we'll put him in here, that's our story, But where Into Darkness really started to fail was with just kind of the end plot of just turning it into this, very generic and, kind of stupid story of like, betrayal within the Federation. We're going to turn it into a military organization. It just seemed very, kind of over the top in a lot of ways. Whereas this one at least is grounded more in what the story is meant to be. I mean, this is not Star Wars. This is Star Trek. Star Trek is more about the science fiction, the exploration, the imagination of what's out there in the universe, in the unknown. That's more of what Star Trek is about versus something like Star Wars, which is way more about the fantasy, about, the kind of the philosophy, the mythology that does go along with it. So it's good to see them kind of ground this one a little bit more in that Star Trek lore, in that, sort of frame of mind. It hurts it at times, but it also helps it at times, because throughout the middle of the movie, even though I didn't care about Crawl, I was fascinated by the rest of the goings on, because there's a very clear first, second, and third act here, and the where they shift are the first act is not super interesting, the second act is really interesting, the third act is not interesting up until you find out who Crawl really is. Which, I don't know why, because the middle part is probably has the least amount of action in the entire movie. But I think it's because it's more of the exploration and the more like the science fiction aspect of Star Trek. You're getting more of that on display in the middle of the movie than you are in the beginning, which has a lot of action. Like the whole attack on the Enterprise scene is full of action, and then the end, which has of course the race against the clock chase scene, and the final fight atop a building in a glass box sort of thing with a really weird gravitational thing. A lot of the science in this movie is quite dubious, which, I mean, you could say that about any science fiction movie, but this one has some really strange things, like a gravity jet stream. Maybe that's a real thing, but it seemed very strange in the context of this movie. Or at least it helped, plot-wise in the movie. Otherwise, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But, I mean, the movie itself, though, definitely falls in the same vein as the other two Star Trek movies with this cast. Chris Pine is definitely that gung-ho Kirk, even though he's a little bit more reserved in this movie as opposed to the first two. He still has, his attitude and his moments where he, brings back that Kirk that we were first introduced to. Zachary Quinto, definitely much more like a Spock character in this movie. He doesn't have the Khan moment like in Into Darkness, which I didn't think fit super well. A lot of the jokes, a lot of the comic relief came from Carl Urban's Bones character and Simon Pegg's Scotty character. Those two really did have a lot of the comic relief. And of course Simon Pegg co-wrote the movie, so you can tell a lot of his humor is just buried in this movie. Zoe Saldana, I thought, did an okay job, but not necessarily on an acting level, but just that they didn't give her a ton of time, which I was a little disappointed in. They gave Sulu a family, which was cool. He has a husband and a daughter, which was pretty neat. Chekhov. This one was hard because Chekhov, Anton Yelchin did a great job as this character, and throughout the entire movie, I'm just watching. Every time he was on screen, I just felt this like sinking feeling because knowing that the actor Anton Yelchin suffered a very tragic death recently. So watching him on the big screen and just it's painful because it's like he's so good in this role. He played the role of Chekhov so well, and yet we're not going to be able to see that again. And it's not just the disappointment of not being able to see it again, but that such a young man lost his life in such a tragic way. So he did a great job in this movie, but I guess it's a good send off for him. But it really did. It was hard to watch sometimes. Sofia Boutella definitely did a great job as Jayla. She just had this demeanor about her that was so good, and a lot of great lines as well. Very similar to Gamora in Guardians of the Galaxy, just kind of like interaction with the humans and some of the words and phrases that we use and just how she reacts to that. It was very humorous. Not to mention she knows how to kick ass, which is really great. Idris Elba, he does a good job as Krall. I don't want to make it sound like Krall is a terrible character, because Idris Elba is a great actor and he plays the role extremely well, but he doesn't the character wasn't written particularly well, but Idris Elba always does a great job, and he definitely is on display here. Now, I'm going to talk about the twist a little bit, because despite the fact I wasn't overly enthused by the twist, there was an aspect of it that I was really impressed that they tackled this. So the twist is, here's the spoiler, no turning back now. The twist is that Krall, Idris Elba's character, is actually human. He was the captain of the Franklin, which is the ship that Jayla's been living in that they use to get off the planet in the end of the movie. He was the captain of that ship, and he's basically been alive for 100 years by using this technology or this ability to drain other people's lives. And it's like, okay, so that's okay. I can buy that. It's science fiction. Anything can happen. But what was interesting about his character were the reasons why he was so angry with the Federation, because throughout the movie he just talks about the Federation as just like this organization of peace and this unity and all this stuff, and he seems very just like it's that kind of typical villain talk of just like I grew up in a culture of war, I don't care about peace. But the reason why he was so adamant about it is interesting, because before he was in the Federation, he was a soldier, and so he was fighting against a lot of these races, the Romulans. He was fighting against all these other people who, basically were threatening, Earth and threatening his home. And then when they win and when they form the Federation, he gets a captain's chair, and he basically has to go to these worlds as a peacekeeper, as somebody who's like going to them as peace. And what's interesting about that is because that's kind of an attitude that real soldiers will have. I was listening to a podcast recently where they were talking about, soldiers returning from World War II and getting angry about, Japanese technology coming to America, because it's like, well, we were fighting these people 10 years ago. I have friends who died when they, fought the Japanese in the war, and now we're basically at peace with them and bringing, their products into the United States. It's that similar kind of mentality of like, peace is not always a good thing for people who, earn that peace. It's kind of this paradox of, obviously wars are fought to create peace, and, I'm just speaking on a philosophical level. I don't necessarily agree with it, but the whole idea of war is to, ultimately lead to peace, the end of war. The end of war is peace, essentially. But the people who fought that war don't always leave that, they don't always leave the war behind. The veterans don't leave it behind. There's that PTSD of knowing that, there are friends who died, allies, comrades who died in this war, and now we're supposed to be friendly with the people who killed them. So and that's the mentality that Krull has, which is fascinating to me that they brought that into the movie. It's a concept that you don't hear a lot about, especially in movies, but I think is an interesting aspect of the character, which is what I'm saying. His character was interesting then. When they revealed who he was then and why he did everything, it made sense and it made it interesting. It just took way too damn long to get there. It took a lot of just very plain, vanilla storytelling to get to the reveal of his character. And, I mean, maybe that was necessary, because if they did reveal that earlier, they might not have been able to do a whole lot with it to make it more interesting. But it certainly was an interesting aspect, and I applaud them for putting that in there. But aside from that, the movie is very standard Star Trek. Well acted, has a lot of funny moments, has a lot of moments that I think they could have toned down the comedy a little bit, and that's not to say that, I don't appreciate comedy. I just think that, like, there are moments where it's a little too batty, and maybe that is Simon Pegg's fault. I don't know. I'm going to blame him anyway. I love you, Simon. That's true. But, the movie does feel a little bit inconsistent throughout from the beginning to the end. And that makes it a little bit hard to appreciate, but at the same time, it's still what the original Star Trek reboot was, just a solid, fun movie. And that's kind of what you wanted. You wanted to go in here, you wanted to have fun, kind of relive these characters, continue, exploring the universe with them, and just have fun. And I think at the end of the day, we did. I think, it is still a fun movie. Justin Lin did put his Fast and Furious ridiculousness into this movie and made it fun. So, pretty good job all around, I'd say, but leaves a lot to be desired. And I've been wavering on, what rating should I give this? It's like, there's an entire point that I'm, like, drawn between. It's like, is it a 6.5 or is it a 7.5? So ultimately, I'm just going to land on 7. I'm giving this movie 7 stars out of 10. Mostly because of how much fun it is and how entertaining it is, and not so much for, I mean, it could have gotten way lower for the storytelling, but I think they managed to at least, recover enough with the comedy and with the characters themselves to make it better, to make it digestible, essentially. Where do I put it on the tier of the other 2 Star Trek movies? Because I'm not going to put it into the same category as the original, the other movies that we've had. In terms of the other, I pretty much would probably put it on the same level as Into Darkness. It's not going to be on the same level as the original, of course. That one is much better. And even though I really do like Into Darkness, I'd say its flaws are pretty apparent, especially now. So I'd probably put Beyond right around the same level as Into Darkness, just in terms of like overall entertainment value or storytelling. One of the two. One is more entertaining than the other. One has a better story. Either way. So that's my review of Star Trek Beyond. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. If you're a Trekkie, I'm sure you got your opinions, so please let me know what you think. And I will see you next time on Gripe. Bye-bye.